The trading post at Coldwater Crossing sat where the wagon road met the river ford, and on a cold morning in October of 1882, a stagecoach passenger stepped through its door, took one look at the woman behind the counter, and asked, loudly, if there was anyone else who could serve her. Verity Ashe did not look up right away. She finished weighing the coffee she was measuring, tied the sack with a neat double knot, and only then raised her eyes, the left side of her face catching the lamplight the way it always did, the old burn scar running from her temple to the corner of her jaw in a pale, twisting ribbon. The passenger's hand had already gone to her own cheek, an unconscious flinch, as if scars might be catching. Ambrose Tate, the clerk boy of 14 who kept the shelves stocked, started forward to take over the sale, but Verity set her hand flat on the counter, a small and steady thing, and said she would be glad to help the lady herself, if the lady would tell her what she needed. The woman bought her coffee and would not meet Verity's eyes again while she did it. Outside, at the hitching rail, a rancher named Silas Boone had already watched the whole exchange through the window glass, and he did not look away once. Not from the scar, not from the steadiness of her hands, not from any of it. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Verity had run Ashe's trading post alone for 2 years, since her father's heart had given out in the back room one January night, with the ledger still open on his knee. Before that, she had run it beside him for 6 years, and before that, she had spent nearly 2 years mostly indoors, wrapped and salved and watched over by a physician named Dr. Emery Voss, who rode out from Fort Randall twice a month to change her dressings. He had decided, somewhere in that long, slow healing, that a girl who could sit still through the worst of it without crying out could learn something useful with her hands, and so between changing bandages he had taught her, patiently, the way a man teaches something he intends to leave behind him. He showed her how a burn ought to be cleaned before it festered, and how to draw poison from a wound, how to set a joint square before it swelled past setting, how willow bark eased a fever, and yarrow closed a cut, and a dozen other plants along the Missouri bottoms could be dried and stored against the winter when no doctor could be reached in time. She had been 12 when the barn caught fire on a July night, the lightning finding the hayloft before anyone in the house woke, and by the time her father dragged her clear the flames, had already taken her mother Constance and her younger brother Thomas, who had gone up to the loft that evening to escape the heat downstairs and never came down again. Nathaniel Ashe never fully recovered from that night either, though his scars did not show the way hers did. He built the trading post up from nothing in the years after, choosing to start fresh at the river crossing rather than rebuild on ground that still smelled of smoke to him, no matter how many seasons passed. And he taught his daughter the business the same patient way Dr. Voss had taught her medicine: weights and measures, freight manifests, the particular art of knowing which trapper or drover could be trusted on credit and which could not. She had a mind for it. She kept the books cleaner than her father ever had, could total a column of figures faster than Ambrose could find his slate, and remembered every account down to the last dime owed. None of that mattered much to the town of Coldwater Crossing, which had decided, sometime in the years since the fire, that a woman marked the way Verity was marked carried something with her that was better left outside the door. It started small, the way these things always did. Mothers steered their children to the far end of the porch when Verity swept it in the mornings, murmuring about drafts and puddles that were not really there. A trapper named Old Pruitt, who had dealt with her father for a decade and always taken his coffee standing at the counter trading stories, began sending his young son in with the furs instead of coming himself, and when Verity asked after his health through the boy, the answer came back thin and vague. Ottilie Crane, wife of the stage line agent and the loudest voice at the ladies' aid meetings, had a way of lowering her voice just enough to be heard when Verity walked past with a delivery basket, remarking to whoever stood nearest that a face like that was a hard thing to explain to children, that surely it meant something, fire marking a person that way, that fire didn't choose its targets for no reason at all. Once, in the spring, 3 of the younger children at the schoolhouse social had run a dare between themselves to see who could get close enough to touch the hem of Verity's dress and run away again, giggling, before she noticed, and she had noticed, and had said nothing, only smoothed her skirt and gone back to her cider as though nothing at all had happened. She heard most of what was said about her. She answered almost none of it. She had learned, in the 2 years since her father died, that a still face and a steady hand did more to end an unkind conversation than any words could. Though the stillness cost her something every single time, a small toll paid in private after the shop was closed, and the shutters were down, and there was no one left to watch her pay it. There was a Sunday in August when the rejection took a different shape entirely. The new schoolteacher, a young woman named Adelaide Finch, fresh from a normal school in Ohio, had brought her pupils to the post for a lesson on trade goods, and one of the smaller boys had split his knee open on the loading dock steps before the lesson properly began. Verity had come around the counter at once, with clean cloth and a jar of the salve she kept for exactly such moments, and Miss Finch had stepped between her and the child, quick and flustered, saying she would rather wait for the boy's mother than have anyone touch him she did not know well. Though she had known Verity by sight and by name for the better part of a year, the boy cried through it, the cut still bleeding into his stocking, until old Mrs. Purdy, who kept the boarding house and had buried 2 husbands and outlived most of the county's opinions, pushed past the schoolteacher without a word and set the child down on a barrel for Verity to tend properly. Miss Finch apologized afterward, awkward and pink-faced, but the apology came only after the fact, and Verity had learned by then not to expect it to come any other way. She cleaned the cut, wrapped it tight, and sent the boy back to his lesson without comment, though Ambrose noticed she kept her jaw set tighter than usual for the rest of that day. The worst of it came in September, during a supply delivery, when a cattle buyer named Jasper Wray stood in the middle of the crowded post and refused to shake her hand on a deal, saying flatly, in front of every man waiting at the counter, that he didn't do business on a scarred ledger, that bad luck had a way of following a face like hers into a man's accounts whether a person believed in curses or not. The room went quiet enough to hear the stove ticking. Ambrose looked hard at his own boots. Verity walked around the counter without hurrying, picked up Ray's bill of sale herself, and read the figures back to him in a voice that did not shake once, then set the paper down on the counter between them and waited, her hands folded, her face giving him nothing at all to work with. Ray took the deal, because the deal was a good one and he was, whatever else he was, not a foolish man. He did not offer his hand a second time, and he did not come back to the post after that, choosing the longer road to Pierre instead, and telling anyone who asked that he preferred the company there. Verity wiped down the counter where his elbows had rested and said nothing to anyone for the rest of that afternoon, though Ambrose noticed she counted the till twice that evening, slower than she needed to, the way a person counts something familiar when they need their hands to be doing anything at all. She had heard variations of Ray's line for 14 years by then, in different mouths and different towns, and she had never once found an answer that satisfied her, because there was no arguing a person out of a superstition they had already decided to believe. The only thing she had ever found that worked, slowly and imperfectly, was time and proof, and the particular stubbornness of simply staying exactly where she was and doing her work exactly as well as she knew how to do it, whether anyone was watching or not. Silas Boone had been coming to the post for 18 months by then, ever since he had taken over the old Holloway spread 6 miles east along the river. He was 34, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who had spent most of his life behind a plow or a branding iron, quiet in a manner the town had mostly given up trying to interpret. He had come to Dakota Territory a widower, though few people in Coldwater Crossing knew the particulars, and he preferred it kept that way. His wife Iris had died of the influenza 3 winters back in Minnesota, along with the infant daughter they had named Grace, only 4 days before the fever took her too, and Silas had sold what little land he held there and ridden west with 2 horses, a wagon, and a silence that had settled into him like weather that never quite broke. Some evenings, in the barn behind his house, he talked to the mare while he worked the leather of a harness that did not strictly need mending. And more often than not, the subject was the woman at the trading post, the way she kept her ledgers, the way she never once shorted a customer and never once let one short her, the way her hands had moved without a single tremor the day she set Ambrose's wrist after he fell from the loading dock in the spring, wrapping the splint tight and telling the boy in a low voice that he had done well not to cry out, though his eyes had been wet the whole while. Silas said very little of this to Verity directly. He was not a man given to saying things he had not thought through first, and he had been thinking about Verity Ashe for a good deal longer than he would have admitted to anyone, Mare included, had she been able to answer him back. It was Silas, in fact, who had once quietly put a stop to the children's dare game at the spring social, not with any speech, only by seating himself on the bench beside Verity, before any of the town's mothers thought to steer their broods elsewhere, and staying there through 2 full reels while he ate his plate of ham in a silence that somehow made the space around her feel less like exile, and more like simply where he had chosen to sit. She had not thanked him for it, and he had not seemed to expect thanks, and neither of them had spoken of it again, though Verity had thought about it more than once in the months that followed, in the particular way a person turns over a small kindness long after the moment that produced it has passed. Not long after Jasper Ray's insult in September, Silas had been standing at the feed store when he overheard a young rancher named Del Hastings repeating Ray's line about scarred ledgers and bad luck, dressing it up as a joke for the benefit of 2 other men loading grain sacks. Silas set down the sack he was carrying, walked over without any particular hurry, and told Hastings, in a voice that carried no heat but left no room for argument either, that he had done business with Miss Ashe for the better part of 2 years, and had never once been shorted a pound of flour or a fair price on anything, and that a man who couldn't say the same about most of the merchants in Pierre had no business laughing at hers. Hastings mumbled something about not meaning any harm by it, and went back to loading his wagon. Silas did not raise his voice once through the whole exchange, and he did not mention it to Verity afterward, though Del Hastings mentioned it to nearly everyone else, and within a week, half the county understood that Silas Boone did not care to hear a word said against the woman at the trading post. The Harvest Social was announced the 2nd week of October, to be held at the schoolhouse the following Saturday, with a bonfire in the yard and tables of food brought by every family in the county. Ottilie Crane organized it the way she organized everything, with a great deal of noise and a firm hand on who sat where. Verity had not planned to go. She had gone to few town socials in 3 years, since the spring gathering where she had sat alone at the end of a bench while 3 women rearranged their skirts to leave a wide gap on either side of her, as though her presence might spread the way a spark did across dry grass. But Ambrose, sweeping the porch that week, mentioned that half the county would be there, and that his mother had asked twice already whether Miss Ashe was planning to come, in a tone that suggested the asking mattered more than the answer itself. Verity thought about it for 2 days. On the 3rd, she pressed her good dress, the deep blue calico with the collar her mother had sewn for her before the fire, and told Ambrose she would mind the post that evening only until dusk, then close early, and walk down herself. She did not tell him why she had changed her mind, and she did not examine the reason too closely herself, though it had something to do with the way Silas Boone had asked her, the week before, whether she planned on attending, in the same plain voice he used to ask about flour prices, as if her answer mattered to him and to nothing else in the world besides. That conversation had happened on a Tuesday, while he waited for her to weigh out a sack of cornmeal. He had asked about the social first, then, without quite meeting her eye, said that he had never much cared for these gatherings himself, standing around a fire making conversation he didn't want, with people who mostly bored him, but that he thought he might go this year if there was a reason worth going for. Verity had kept her eyes on the scale, watching the needle settle, and told him that seemed like a poor way to spend an evening, going somewhere for a reason instead of for the social itself. He had said that depended entirely on the reason, and left it there, paid for his cornmeal, and walked out to his wagon without saying anything further, and Verity had stood behind the counter a long moment after the door closed, the scale still balanced in front of her, before she went back to her ledger. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The schoolhouse yard was full by the time Verity arrived, lanterns strung between the porch posts, long tables groaning under pies and hams and jars of preserves, the bonfire already built high and waiting for full dark. She found a spot near the edge of things, close enough to be present and far enough to not require conversation, and for the better part of an hour, that arrangement held well enough. She watched children chase each other between the tables, their shrieks bright against the fiddle music. She watched Ottilie Crane direct the seating at the head table, with the satisfaction of a woman who had never once had to wonder whether she belonged somewhere in a room. She was refilling her cup of cider near the pump when she heard the first scream, high and sharp, cutting clean through the noise of the crowd, and she turned in time to see 6-year-old Jonah Crane, Ottilie's youngest, stumble backward from the bonfire with his sleeve fully alight, the flame already climbing past his elbow toward his shoulder, while he screamed and flailed his arm. The very motion that would only feed the fire more air and drive it faster up the cotton. What happened next took perhaps 4 seconds, though every person in that yard would later swear it felt far longer than that. Verity was already moving before she had decided to move, closing the distance at a dead run with her cup still falling from her hand behind her, and she did not slow when she reached him. She took him down hard onto the trampled grass, rolling him with her own body pressed against the flame to smother it, her bare hands beating at the burning sleeve without a moment's hesitation, the fire catching briefly at the cuff of her own good blue dress, before she tore the boy's sleeve free of his arm entirely and flung the smoldering cloth into the dirt beside them. The yard had gone silent except for Jonah's crying, and in that silence, in front of every family in Coldwater Crossing, Verity knelt over the boy and did exactly what Dr. Emery Voss had spent 2 years teaching a burned and grieving 12-year-old girl to do. She did not wait for anyone's permission. She called for water, cold, not warm, and Ambrose was already running for the pump before she finished saying it. She checked the boy's arm with hands that did not shake, the skin reddened and blistering along the forearm, but the worst of it stopped short of his shoulder, and she told him, in a voice pitched low and steady, that he had been very brave, braver than most grown men she had treated in her time, and that the water was going to feel strange, but it would help, and it did help, because she knew exactly how long to hold a burn under cold water, and exactly what a scorched sleeve of cotton could do to skin left untreated. That knowledge had been bought with her own scars 14 years before, and she spent it now without a second thought. For one strange, suspended instant, kneeling over the boy with the smell of scorched cotton thick in her nose, Verity felt the old fire again, not as memory exactly, but as something closer to weather passing through her. The loft, the smoke, her mother's voice cut off mid-word. She did not let it slow her hands. If anything, her hands moved faster because of it, because she alone in that whole yard understood precisely what 4 more seconds of flame would cost this child for the rest of his life, and she was not going to let him carry a version of what she carried, if there was anything at all she could do to stop it. Somewhere behind her she heard a man's voice, not Silas's, shouting for someone to fetch a blanket, and another voice asking was that not the scarred woman, and a third voice, sharper, telling the second one to hush and let her work. She did not turn to see who had spoken. She had Jonah's sleeve free and the worst of the char cut away with her own belt knife before anyone else in that yard had finished deciding whether to move at all. Ottilie Crane arrived at a run, white-faced, her fine church shawl trailing in the dirt behind her, and found her son already wrapped in a clean cloth Verity had cut straight from her own petticoat. His crying settled into hiccups, his color steady and his breathing even. The doctor was 2 counties away delivering a breech birth and would not return until morning. For the better part of an hour, in full view of the entire social, Verity Ashe sat on the schoolhouse steps with Jonah Crane's head resting in her lap, checking his breathing, checking the color of his lips, keeping the burn cool and clean beneath its cloth, and telling him quietly about a boy she had once known who broke his arm the same week his favorite dog had a litter of puppies. Stringing the story out long enough to keep his mind off the pain until his breathing evened and his eyes finally grew heavy with sleep. Nobody in that yard moved to help her. Nobody needed to. She had already done everything that needed doing, and every person present had watched her do it with the same steady hands that measured out coffee and kept clean ledgers. The same hands the town had spent 2 years treating as something to be avoided at arm's length. Silas Boone crossed the yard while the fire still crackled low behind him, and the crowd stood frozen in the particular silence of people watching something reorganize itself in front of their eyes. He did not say anything grand. He was not a man for speeches, and he had learned, across 3 winters of grief and 18 months of watching Verity Ashe run a business better than most men in the territory could have managed it, that the right words were usually the fewest ones available. He lowered himself onto the step beside her, close enough that his shoulder nearly touched hers, and for a long moment, he simply looked at Jonah's steady breathing and the burn already cooling beneath its wet cloth. Then he looked at Verity, at the soot smudged across her hands and the torn sleeve of her good blue dress and the scar on her face that the firelight had turned to copper instead of shame, and he said, plainly, that he would consider it a kindness if she would let him sit with her a while, here tonight and every social after this one, for as long as she would have him. "Sit with me," he said again, quieter, as though the words needed saying twice before either of them could fully believe them. Verity did not answer right away. She looked down at the boy sleeping against her arm, and then she looked up at Silas Boone, at the plain, steady face of a man who had watched her for 18 months and had never once needed a burning child to convince him what she was worth. She said, at last, that she supposed she could manage that. It was not much of an answer, spoken in the same even voice she used for weighing coffee. It was, all the same, enough. Ottilie Crane knelt in front of Verity that same evening, took both of her soot-streaked hands in her own, without any hesitation at all, and said she was sorry. Sorry for every word she had ever let slip about bad luck and fire finding what it wanted. Sorry that it had taken her own son's arm to teach her what a scarred face had nothing whatsoever to do with the size of a woman's heart. She did not say it loudly, and she did not say it for the benefit of the crowd still gathered at the edges of the yard, but enough people heard it that the words traveled through Coldwater Crossing faster than any gossip Ottilie had ever carried in her life before that night. Jasper Wray, who had driven the long road to Pierre for 2 full months, rather than shake Verity's hand across a counter, heard the story from 3 different men before the week was out, and when his own daughter came down with a fever severe enough to frighten him a fortnight later. He was the one who rode to the post at midnight, hat in his hands, and asked whether Miss Ashe might come look at her, because the doctor was again away and he had heard, from every mouth in the county, that there was no one better to ask than her. Verity rode out with him before he finished the sentence. She sat with the girl until dawn broke over the ridge, brought the fever down with the same yarrow and willow bark she had dried and stored through the long summer, and when Wray tried to press payment on her at first light, standing awkward in his own kitchen doorway, she told him plainly that the debt between them had already been settled the night he shook her hand over that bill of sale, whether he had meant it as settlement or not, and left it there. Wray stood in his own doorway a long moment after she rode off toward home, turning his hat over in his hands, and told his wife later that he had been wrong about a great many things in his life, but rarely so plainly and so completely wrong as he had been about the woman at Ashe's trading post. Adelaide Finch came to the post herself the following week, without any of her pupils this time, and asked, haltingly, whether Verity might be willing to teach a short lesson to the older children on how to dress a simple wound, since it seemed to her now that a schoolteacher, who could not do that much for her own students, had no real business teaching them anything else. Verity agreed, and stood in front of the schoolhouse the following Friday, with a roll of clean bandage and a basket of dried yarrow, showing a room full of children exactly how her own hands had been taught to work, and if anyone in that room still flinched at her scar, they did not flinch for long, not once she began to speak. Dr. Emery Voss, retired now and living quietly in Sioux Falls, received a letter that winter from a woman in Coldwater Crossing he had not heard from in 3 years, thanking him for 2 years of patience with a frightened, silent, badly burned girl, and telling him that everything he had taught her had finally found its full use, had likely saved a child's arm from ruin and, not long after, another child's life besides. He wrote back a single line, framed later and kept behind the counter of Ashe's trading post where every visitor could read it, that said only that he had never once doubted it would. The post changed after that, though not in any way a person could point to directly on a map or a calendar. Trappers who had once sent their sons in with the furs began coming through the door themselves again, taking their coffee standing at the counter the way old Pruitt used to. Mothers no longer steered their children to the far end of the porch, and more than a few of them brought their sick and their scraped and their fevered straight to Verity's counter before they thought to send for anyone else at all. She kept the ledgers exactly as clean as she always had. She still measured coffee with the same double knot on every sack, still totaled her columns faster than Ambrose could find his slate. The only real difference, most days, was that Silas Boone's wagon sat at the hitching rail more often than not, and that he had taken to arriving early enough in the evening to walk her home along the river road when she closed the shutters at dusk, the two of them mostly quiet together, the way 2 people can be quiet once quiet has stopped meaning alone for either of them. They married the following June, in the schoolhouse yard where the bonfire had once stood, with Jonah Crane, his arm fully healed but for a faint pale mark he liked to show off to anyone who would look, serving as ring-bearer at his mother's firm insistence. Verity wore blue again, a new dress this time, though she kept the burned one folded carefully in the bottom of her trunk, not from any need to remember what she already carried on her face every day of her life, but because her father had always said a person ought to keep the things that taught them something, even the hardest ones. Silas stood at the front of that yard with the same plain steadiness he brought to everything he did, and when the minister asked if he would have her, he said yes, ma'am, in the low, even voice of a man who had already settled the answer in his own mind a long while before anyone had thought to ask the question aloud. Old Mrs. Purdy sat in the front row next to Dr. Voss's framed letter, which Verity had insisted on bringing along for the day, and Adelaide Finch stood at the back with a row of her scrubbed and solemn pupils, several of whom had learned to tie a proper bandage that spring, and were prouder of it than of anything else they had been taught all year. Verity moved out to the Boone place along the river that summer, though she kept the trading post running with Ambrose minding the counter 3 days a week while she taught him, slowly, some of what Dr. Voss had taught her, so that Coldwater Crossing would never again be a place where help depended on one pair of hands alone. The mare in Silas's barn, the same mare who had listened to 3 years of a lonely man's evening confessions without once offering an opinion, grew accustomed to a second set of footsteps in the barn at dusk, and Silas took to telling Verity, only half joking, that the horse had liked her before he'd worked up the nerve to say so himself, and that he supposed he owed the animal a debt of gratitude for her patience. That autumn, on evenings when the trading post had closed and the ledgers were squared for the day, Silas would sit on the porch step beside his wife while the last light came down gold over the river, and more often than not he found some small reason to say it again, quiet and unhurried, the same 2 words he had first offered her on a set of schoolhouse steps with a burned and sleeping child between them. Sit with me, she always did. It was, by then, less an invitation than a plain fact of their life together, the truest thing either of them had built out of 2 separate griefs, a home earned not through anything given to her out of pity, but through everything she had always been underneath the scar, seen at last and in full by a man patient enough to look past the first glance and keep looking. Jonah Crane grew up telling the story of that October night to anyone who would listen, embellishing it a little more each year the way children do, until in his telling the fire had climbed halfway to the treetops, and Verity Ashe had walked through it without so much as singeing her sleeve. Verity never corrected him. She let him keep his version, because the truth of it, plain and unembellished, had always been enough for her, and because some stories are better left to grow in the telling than pinned down too closely to the facts that made them. What mattered, in the end, was not how the fire had looked that night, but who had stayed close by afterward, and who had not, and Coldwater Crossing, slowly and imperfectly, had finally learned the difference. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.